Hello everybody and welcome again to Black Cat Theology, our ongoing video lecture series on themes and issues in the later philosophy of Martin Heidegger and contemporary non-metaphysical theology. This is the 7th installment in our lecture series. Let's begin by reminding ourselves of where we left off. We saw that at least 3 proto-theologies can be extracted from Heidegger's later writings. One of these is preferable to the other 2 for reasons that Heidegger himself accepts. According to this third and most promising proto-theology, God or the holy or divinity is neither the same as any particular being, nor is it the same as the non-metaphysical event of being, or Ereignis in German, but rather the holy or God or divinity is a particular non-being that Heidegger calls the last God. And unlike other non-beings that are fictions, for example, Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or the Easter Bunny, the last God does something very important according to Heidegger, something positive. Namely, it shelters the non-metaphysical event of being and presumably the beings that show up in the course of that event. And so Heidegger says that the last God divinizes the non-metaphysical event. That's his way of saying that. So clearly, the fictions like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny and so forth, they don't divinize anything or shelter anything. That's simply lore. Those are simply folk tales or stories. So the last God is not like that. Now, we also saw that according to this proto-theology, as we just said, the non-metaphysical event in some sense needs the holy in order to divinize the non-metaphysical event. And there's a correlative or a reciprocal sense in which the non-metaphysical event is needed by the holy. The holy needs non-metaphysical being, and we suggested that what Heidegger may have in mind here is that by engaging or becoming transitioned into non-metaphysical ways of thinking, we might avoid certain metaphysical paradoxes or metaphysical conundrums that threaten to cloud or obscure or interfere with our understanding of divinity. So that's the third proto-theology. We saw that it fits very well with the narrative that Heidegger lays forth in the Beiträge zur Philosophie, according to which there is this possible transformation that we might undergo from metaphysical ways of thinking into non-metaphysical thinking. That's the Ereignis. That's the first advent, which makes possible, even though it doesn't guarantee, the second advent, which is the manifestation or the revelation, the passing by, if you will. Heidegger uses that way of speaking, the passing by of the last God. So the narrative that Heidegger sketches fits very well with the third proto-theology. We also saw, though, that this proto-theology is really quite abstract. It's rather abstruse and attenuated. It's really nothing more than a debater's position in logical space. So that in order to rectify that abstraction, that blankness of it, if you will, there needs to be some kind of definite experiential content or phenomenological content associated with it or injected into it. And as we proceeded in our lecture series, as we proceeded in our considerations, we saw that Heidegger suggests 2 ways of doing that. Sometimes he speaks about the struggle between world and earth. That's the struggle between the attempt to find clarity or disclosure as over against obscurity or what is hidden from us. So that's the struggle between world and earth. And in a different vein, sometimes he speaks about Gelassenheit as a kind of tranquilized serenity or a letting be. This often occurs when he's speaking about the fourfold dwelling among the earth, the sky, divinities, and mortals. So, how do we get from the proto-theology to genuine theological options? There we saw that it depends on how we assign these different phenomenologies to different parts of Heidegger's narrative. If we take, on the one hand, if we take the struggle between world and earth, that particular experience, to pertain to the advent of the non-metaphysical event of being, whereas we take Gelassenheit, or this tranquilized, energized tranquility, to pertain to our encounter with the holy, we have a Gelassenheit theology. Alternatively, if we reverse these assignments and we take Gelassenheit, or tranquilized dwelling or energized tranquility, if we take that to pertain to the advent of the non-metaphysical event of being, while we take struggle, Streit, to pertain to our encounter with God, then we have a Streit theology. So these are two very different theological options, not yet full-blown theologies, but theological options that are somewhat more experientially determinate than the third proto-theology. We also discussed in the last lecture how there are scriptural episodes in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Actually, we did this in the last two lectures, where these different theological options can be used as lenses to interpret the relevant scriptural episode. So that's what's occupied us up to this point. Now, what I want to do today is begin to evaluate the different theological options. That is, how should we decide, for which of these options should we decide? Which one should we decide to develop in the rest of the lecture series? And what I'm going to do is construct over the course of the next two lectures, this one and the next one, a ledger where I describe some of the pluses and the minuses of both Streit theology and Gelassenheit theology. And at the end of this discussion, when we've completed the ledger and we sort of listed all the pros and cons, we should be in a position to make a tentative decision, at least, or let's say a provisional decision in favor of one of them. Now, I want to be very, very clear, as I've said before, that our decision is by no means intended to preclude the development of the other proto-theology. In fact, in order to fulfill the overall theological project that I'm sketching within this general framework, both of those options need to be developed, because the faith that they both attempt to address and to elaborate or to elucidate is common to them. And so that faith is not reducible to either one. When we have both of them before us, then we can be in a better position to draw a hard and fast distinction between faith per se and these different theologies as different ways of reflecting upon faith, if you will. So let's proceed to the ledger, the first half of the ledger. The first half of the ledger deals with the theology of Streit. And so what I'm going to do today is list what I consider to be two advantages of Streit theology, and then I'm going to list three disadvantages that I see. These are by no means meant to be completely exhaustive. It's simply a ledger, and so, as I said, provisional, but I do think it provides us some guidance in the execution of our project. So let's begin with number one on the positive side. Let's begin with the positive things about Streit theology, the strengths. So what's the first strength? The first strength is that this theological option does, in fact, inject very definite experiential content into the proto-theology, the third and most promising proto-theology. It makes it less abstract and more concrete, because it does, as a matter of fact, identify our fundamental encounter with God as one of wrestling with a paradox or with something that's dark and obscure. And so our attempt to try to understand divinity, as far as we can do that as human beings, is our attempt to bring light or openness or clarity to our encounter with God as something that's dark and mysterious and very puzzling and enigmatic. This kind of attitude recurs at various points in the history of theology. One might think of Luther and his theology of the cross, where we're never going to be able to fathom that completely. At some point, we need to embrace that as a mystery with which we continue to struggle in our ongoing lives as Christians. Or we might think of Kierkegaard and the leap of faith, where that's not a purely rational deduction, but that's an existential choice to live with, and in fact to allow our identity to be defined as people who have faith in God and continue to struggle with that enigma over the course of our entire lives on earth. So Streit theology certainly has the advantage of bringing definite experiential content to the third proto-theological option third proto-theology that we described. Look at what Heidegger says about this, some of these passages, which are very powerful and very evocative. They have a lot of very powerful experiential language in them. Let me just give you one. He says, above all, however, that which constitutes the inner splitting open of the event of being, and according to the respective appropriation either remains veiled or steps forth, can never be counted up and presented in a table or in any of the pigeonholes of a system. Instead, every saying of the fissure is a thoughtful word to God and at the human being, and thereby into Dasein, and so into the strife of world and earth. So notice that Heidegger contrasts the idea of just some metaphysical system or system of categories or some system of abstractions with an encounter of God in terms of strife, where that's no longer just an intellectual position. Our very status as human beings and as people of faith is at stake through this struggle. That defines who we are. That's very important. So obviously, phenomenological content or experiential content has been injected into the third and most promising proto-theology because we all understand what it's like to struggle with something that's deep, dark, and enigmatic. That's the first strength of Streit theology. The second strength is closely related to that. And we might put the point this way. Sometimes when we think about God, it's sort of easy to treat this as almost something very anodyne. It doesn't really have any substantive, it doesn't really challenge us. It also is, it's almost as if our attitude towards God and thinking about God slips into a kind of quiescence. Let's put it that way. A kind of bland quiescence is a kind of comforting Sunday morning stillness where we have all these warm and fuzzy thoughts about divinity, but it gets kind of blah and bland, and there's nothing stimulating. There's nothing energizing or challenging about that, and so we can get bored with it. By the time if we spend too much time in that mindset, if we allow our encounter with God to lapse into this kind of quiescence, eventually we might just get bored with the whole thing and say, well, who cares? It's just not interesting. It's not something that's a vital issue for me and for us in our lives, both as individuals and collectively as a community of faith. So Streit theology obviously doesn't involve any kind of quiescence or placid Sunday morning stillness lapsing into or tending towards boredom, because there's nothing boring about wrestling with a paradox or with an enigma. That can be very exciting, that can be very energizing. So that's a second advantage that Streit theology has. Okay, now let's go to the other side of the ledger for Streit theology, and let's look at the weaknesses. These are potential weaknesses of that theological option, and I'm going to mention three. The first one is this. What if it turns out that this experience of struggling with enigma is too daunting, right? If a problem or a challenge becomes too difficult, then we might give up. We might find ourselves so intimidated by it that we say, well, I can't figure this out, and we get tired. You know, if our constant relationship to God is one of struggle and strife and trying to wrest the openness of world from the obscurity of earth, for trying to wring unconcealment from concealment, well, it's understandable how somebody might become enervated and exhausted by that to the point that he or she gives up and says, well, I just can no longer live like this. It's too hard. It's too daunting. That's a real threat that Streit theology, that Streit theological option carries. Okay, that's the first weakness of the Streit theological option. What's the second one? The second one is that whether we pursue Streit or Gelassenheit theology as a way of unpacking and developing that third proto-theology, there needs to be a very, very clear line between metaphysical confusion or conundrum on the one hand and our experience or encounter with God, obviously. Now, the difficulty here when we look at Streit theology is that if our experience of God our fundamental experience of God is taken to be one of encountering something that's very enigmatic, or a conundrum, a paradox, or maybe even a contradiction. If that's the experience, what is the difference precisely between that kind of conundrum and a metaphysical confusion? The line here begins to blur, so that we threaten to lose our grip on what it is that distinguishes, metaphysical paradoxes, which are problematic, from religious paradoxes, like our encounter with the holy as something enigmatic, which are legitimate. In other words, the Streit theologian needs to give us a principled distinction between paradoxes, conundrums, or even contradictions on the one hand that are illegitimate because they're metaphysical confusions, or perhaps some other kind of philosophical confusion, and on the other hand, religious paradoxes, conundrums, or even contradictions pertaining to our experience of the holy or divinity or the last God, which are not confusions, but in fact are of vital importance and something that we want to accept. So what is it that makes the difference or constitutes the difference between paradoxes or conundrums that are illegitimate, like certain metaphysical ones and other philosophical ones, and conundrums or paradoxes which are crucial and vital and acceptable? So far, we don't have any explanation of that difference, and that's a problem for Streit theology. Finally, for today, the third problem is that it's very hard to see so far how Streit theology relates to fundamental tenets of Christian orthodoxy. And I want to make it clear that in this lecture series, and now it should be made more clear at this point, I am a Christian theologian. I'm a Roman Catholic, but a Christian who happens to be a Roman Catholic, but I'm pursuing theology in the Christian faith tradition. I certainly encourage people from other faith traditions to encourage theology along these lines in their own faith traditions. I certainly welcome that and would be very interested to hear more about it, but I work within the Christian faith tradition. And so whatever theological option I or we who share that tradition develop in this theological framework that I'm suggesting had better have some very specific connections to the cardinal tenets of the Christian faith, such as the Trinity, the incarnation of God in the human being Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, the God-human, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which makes possible our redemption if we have faith in him, and other doctrines like the ascension and so forth that we don't need to get into right here. But these doctrines are non-negotiable for a Christian. Now, what connection does Streit theology have to all of that? So far, we haven't seen anything about that. I haven't said anything about that, and I fully recognize my responsibility to do that if I'm going to develop this particular theological framework in a Christian faith tradition. So that's the third weakness of Streit theology. So what we have so far, if we want to use a sports metaphor, is for Streit theology, the score is 2-3. We have 2 advantages and 3 disadvantages. Next week, what I want to do is carry forward the same kind of comparative analysis, an analysis comparing strengths and weaknesses, and apply it to Gelassenheit theology. And once we've completed that, hopefully, and God willing, we will then be in a position to compare the scores, if you will. That will then warrant a particular decision, for now, a provisional decision, about which one of these theological options we should pursue. And that means which of these theological options should we now work upon to develop into a full-blown Christian theology. So that is our task right now. We've completed part of it today. Hopefully we will continue next time, and we will be in a better position by the end of the next lecture to forward that evaluation. So thank you for joining me. I encourage you to think more about these issues, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments on my YouTube page, on my channel. I'll do my best to answer those questions, and we can try to find answers together. So thank you again for joining me. I hope you have a good day, and I look forward to talking with you next time. Bye-bye.